This is SSN.
Stories Studio Network.
The Change for Good Roads podcast series brings together influential Canadian experts from sectors of sustainable cities, equity, accessibility, physical activity, mobility, and road safety to discuss how to increase support for road safety action. Hosted by Parachute's President and CEO Pamela Fuselli, each episode will feature a discussion with an expert on urban road safety. Road safety measures have a broad impact on urban communities, with a number of benefits ranging from economic and environmental to equity and health. Today, we're exploring the impact of our transportation system on the environment and our global climate as key components of healthy, active, and safe urban roads. In Canada, the transportation sector is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and 53% of transport emissions come from passenger vehicles, such as cars and light trucks. Increases in active and multimodal transportation in urban communities can contribute to a reduction in air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and noise pollution, which affect the overall health and well-being of communities locally and globally. By promoting and making multiple forms of transportation available, urban road users can make a shift to using alternative, safe, and more environmentally friendly transport options such as walking, cycling, wheeling, and public transit. Joining me today is Brent Todderton. Brent is a respected practitioner and thought leader in city planning and design with over 30 years of experience in advanced urbanism, transportation, and change management. He has advised and collaborated with cities, states, agencies, and developers globally, including Vancouver, New York, Sydney, and Helsinki, among others. Brent established Todderton Urban Works in 2012 after serving as Vancouver's chief planner. During his tenure, he oversaw all development, design, and architecture in Vancouver, created innovative approaches to planning and policy and design in Calgary, and consulted for cities across Canada. Brent's current work includes inspirational speaking, workshops, teaching, writing, and creative media. He's a founding president of the Council for Canadian Urbanism, a regular writer for Fast Company, Huffington Post, City Lab, and Spacing, and a sought-after international speaker on advanced urbanism. Brent, thanks so much for being part of Parachute's Change for Good Roads podcast.
My pleasure, Pamela.
You are a tell it like it is person. So let's start with the straightforward question. How is motor vehicle transportation impacting our environment, health, and safety?
Well, hugely is the short answer, I suppose. We don't need to get into the stats to understand the powerful implication of how we get around, particularly in cities, affecting not only the climate emergency, air pollution, and its corresponding effects on urban health, all sorts of elements of public health related to whether or not we are creating car dependency and obesogenic environments, and all the implications of that for preventable diseases, affordability, and household affordability that's tied to how many cars we think we need to own and how incredibly expensive they are. And public affordability, too, in the context of infrastructure cars being by far the most expensive form of infrastructure of any way of getting around in cities. Social equity, classism, racism as it plays out in the context of mobility and urban form. Infrastructure costs near bankrupting many North American cities. You can't swing a stick without hitting a major public interest that's being affected by how we are encouraging or not encouraging people to get around in cities. So it's kind of the essential no-brainer conversation to have with regard to just about any issue we're facing as a society and how to improve the situation with any of those issues in terms of how we're building our cities. So I didn't start off as a transportation specialist specifically. I'm not a specialist. I'm a city planner, so I'm a broad generalist urbanist, but I have done a very deep dive throughout my entire career on the transportation piece, because if you can't improve the transportation piece, you probably can't improve your cities in the context of just about any definition of success we have.
It just is so integral to all parts of life. And I think that the conversation has changed over the last even 5 to 10 years. In your experience, how have you seen that the conversations around mobility and transportation and some of the issues that you brought forward that I think would be maybe a surprise to people, like racism? How have those conversations around the mobility and transportation really changed?
It's changing really fast. And we were having, for example, a so-called bike boom before the pandemic. And about 5 to 10 years ago, we started talking about a bike boom. We've always been talking about urban public transit in the context of successful cities. And of course, walking has always been part of the conversation, but it's always, certainly in North America and other places that are similar, like Australia, New Zealand, etc. It's always been not just a cars first situation, but a cars first, second, and third situation until about 10 years ago, I'll say, when there was a real strong, partially demographically fueled interest in multimodal cities and at least providing more choice. And then in the last 5 years, that little boom became a big boom, if you will. And boy, it's the multiplier effect in the speed in the conversation's just been amazing. And during the pandemic, particularly, as we've been having the responsibility to have a fundamentally different conversation about mobility, both during the pandemic and how we got around safely during the pandemic, but post-pandemic, as we also post-pandemic in the context of work from home being a game changer relative to certain transportation issues such as commuting to work each day. So massive shift in conversations, partially demographically driven, as I said, with the whole idea of millennials being less interested in car dependency, less interested in the definition of freedom being getting your driver's license versus, getting a computer. So partially demographically driven, but I say it's also about the ubiquitousness of information and the access to other models and better ideas. And social media, the growth of social media, I think, has corresponded with that change in conversation. Because I used to say, I've been at this for 31 years as a professional. I used to say you had a game-changing epiphany if you managed to get to Copenhagen and ride a bike for a few days. But not that many people were getting to Copenhagen and riding a bike for a few days. But now you can't open social media without seeing a video of somebody riding a bike in Copenhagen. You don't need to experience it to understand it. And it isn't just Copenhagen, it's so many other cities. And we're constantly having access to the innovation and the corresponding success that other cities are having, and not just international cities like Paris during the pandemic and Copenhagen, etc., but North American cities. So it isn't just, well, that's Europe. We're different because we're North American. North American cities are seeing dramatic success, and we're all hearing about it faster. We almost are hearing about it in real time now, and we're seeing video evidence and such. And so it isn't just professionals that know this anymore. We've democratized the obviousness of needing better urban transportation and the access to the better examples and the success stories out there. It's just so constant. And so I used to feel, early in my career, I had to spend a lot of time describing and showing pictures and trying to convince people that there were other ways and have them say, but don't you understand, we're different in our city, fill in the blank city name. But now it's just so easy. And it's citizens, not just professionals, but citizens that are aware, they're educated, and they are demanding better. I've had people say to me, I follow you and 5 or 6 other people on Twitter, and that's given me all the ammunition I need to go into City Hall and have a conversation with a traffic engineer. That's a fundamentally different conversation than activists have probably had in the past.
It certainly has. I have noticed the same thing of the increase in the community response to changes and the demands that they are making so that they have these choices. And I think even the pandemic really showed, if you have the infrastructure in place, there are people who will choose that type of transportation. And they were they were wanting that prior, but there was, as you say, a speeding up of the conversation, and then the actual action to see those types of things being built in communities. So it's just a total different conversation. As you say, there's so much more appetite for it. People are really interested in engaging in it.
And at the same time that there's been this, I'd say there's been a transformation of the profession. There's been a generational turnover where the so-called, the old white men who were running all the transportation and planning departments retired and didn't have a chance to crush the dreams and aspirations of younger professionals quite so successfully as they did in previous generations. And so we've had this new generation of more diverse professionals with certainly much different perspectives about active transport, walking, biking, and transit, multimodal cities, more choice, less dependency. So you've had the professional transformation. You certainly have had the community and activist and civic transformation with the access to the information through social media and mainstream media, etc. But then you've also had the city level and government level transformation that goes like this. Cities have realized that it is a critical key to their economic development success to provide more transportation choice. It's become one of the legs in a sort of a 4-leg table approach to economic development, where if you want to attract and retain talent, and thus employers, you have to provide these options. And it really ramped up when Amazon did the launch a few years back ago of a competition to have their second headquarters, the second Amazon headquarters. Right. And in their list of criteria, they said you need to be a city that has public transit and walking and biking infrastructure. And that, to a certain extent, I remember when that happened, and that to a certain extent was a game changer, because people like me said, see, even if you don't have that infrastructure and thus can't compete for Amazon's headquarters or any headquarters that wants those things, you better start working on it now, because the next time and the time after that and the time after that, you don't want to still be caught without that infrastructure and thus not be competitive. And I think it was a turning point for cities to realize that this kind of infrastructure for walking, biking, and transportation isn't just transportation infrastructure. It's economic development infrastructure. I did some work for the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they said, Brent, we don't need walking, biking, and transit because you can drive across the city at any time of the day in 15 minutes, because they had widened their roads and built so much parking that you could shoot a cannon down their wide streets during drive time and probably not hit a car. They had so overbuilt their car infrastructure. And so they said, we don't need these other options. But the reality was that the young people that they wanted to keep, who were going to university and then leaving, wanted other choices, period. So it didn't matter that it was easy to drive across the city. They wanted the choice to bike safely, take public transit, walk, or all of the above, and maybe drive. They wanted more choice. And if you wanted those young people, you needed to provide it. And so the aha moment was that this was an economic development strategy, not just a transportation strategy. And that's been a game changer at the city and government level. Mm-hmm. So there's there's a professional transformation, a civic and community and public transformation, and a government transformation, where it's recognized that this is about economic development. It's also about climate mitigation. It's also about affordability. It's also about infrastructure cost saving and keeping your taxes low. Almost every definition of government success is affected by how smartly we do transportation. So it's just become really, really hard to still be a dinosaur. Really hard, because almost every excuse has disappeared, and there's just so much obviousness to the need to do things differently and better.
Yeah, they've really all seen how this meets a lot of the needs that they are looking to address. And they never thought that road safety and transportation availability was one of the solutions. What are some of the successes you've seen?
By the way, you just mentioned road safety, and I forgot to say that. Obviously, saving lives is a big part of this conversation, because, I don't need to tell you, car-related collisions are one of the biggest killers of people and are
Hmm.
the biggest killer, global killer of young people. I can't believe I forgot to mention that. So it's if you're not motivated by climate emergency or affordability or infrastructure or equality and equity or saving public money, hopefully you're motivated by saving human lives. So it just becomes harder and harder to be on the wrong side of this issue. I'm sorry to interrupt your question, but you reminded me that I'd forgot about human life.
No, that's important. And it's surprisingly how you would think that that would be very high on people's list of reasons why they would want to do something, but you would actually be surprised at how often it gets bumped down for
Yes.
all of those other reasons that you listed.
Because we've accepted car-related death as background noise,
Yeah.
something that just happens and there's nothing we can do about it. When in fact there's a lot we can do about it. We are designing our streets to be unsafe. While claiming we're designing them to be safe, ironically. We're traveling at speeds that are fundamentally unsafe. We're doing everything wrong if our concern was human life. So of course we could save human life, but we've assumed that that's not the case. It's just a thing we're accepting in order for society to run effectively, and that's just a false narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a bit about, I want to make sure we have some time to hear about some of the work that you're doing and some of the successes that you've been seeing, maybe as examples for other cities who are thinking about what can they do.
Well, certainly there are very inspiring cities globally. I'm having the benefit of or the burden of working in almost every part of the world. And I say the burden because when you see what other parts of the world are doing, it makes it a lot harder to be patient with North American cities because I know what's possible. Certainly European, Latin American cities are doing moves much faster and more progressively than we are in North America. They have a tendency to recognize a crisis like the pandemic and use it to create permanent change for quality of life after the pandemic. While in North America, we learned some things reluctantly during the pandemic, and then we fixed them temporarily, and then went back to
Back.
cars only and car dependency as soon as we possibly could. While other parts of the world permanently changed for the better their cities. So it can be frustrating, but I'll say this: the inspiring cities are the ones anywhere that are showing you can do it a lot faster and more successfully than we thought. Because you look at what Paris has done in the last 5 years, and people think, well, that's Paris. No, Paris was choking in cars, and still to a certain extent is. But the amount of transformation Paris has had around multimodal infrastructure has been remarkable, and it's worked. Paris has become a bike city
Hmm.
pretty quickly within years, not decades. And it was not that. Anybody who thinks Paris was a bike city before clearly has never tried to ride a bike there. Even when they introduced VLib, I was one of the early riders of that, and I felt fundamentally vulnerable all the time. So it was not a safe place to ride. But there are people in North America who don't want to hear about Paris, and because it's just too different. They can't see their city change based on what Paris has done. So what I like are the unlikely heroes,
Hmm.
the cities that did something that you didn't expect. And when they do it, you say, well, if they can do it, why can't we? And so when Calgary, Canada, does probably the best infrastructure network pilot in their city center of any city in North America, when Calgary does that, and then when Edmonton doubles down because of the Calgary-Edmonton rivalry and doesn't even do a pilot, just goes ahead and builds it. When Alberta cities can do this, what's your excuse? And during the pandemic, when Oakland, California, which nobody expected to be a hub of innovation, was one of the first cities to close down 10% of its entire street network to cars and open that 10% to people so that people could get outside during the pandemic and get to work safely, biking or walking and meeting their neighbors, then a lot of cities were inspired by Oakland because Oakland isn't Paris. And it isn't Copenhagen, it's Oakland. And if Oakland can do it, I love the phrase, if fill in the blank city can do it, what's our excuse? Right. So I do find in the work that I'm doing, I look for the cities that are punching above their weight, the cities that you don't necessarily expect. And then I toot that horn like crazy because I say, if we can do it, if that city can do it, so can you. So, in my work, I don't necessarily look for the sexiest cities. I look for the cities that are scalable, that are inspirational to many, many other cities out there, because that's what we need. And that's no disrespect to the Copenhagens and the Parises. I'm inspired by those cities too. But what I've learned over doing this over 31 years is it's just too easy for people to say, yeah, but we're not Copenhagen or we're not Paris.
Right, and discount those.
Right.
I think you've kind of thrown down a gauntlet of competition of, who's going to be the next innovative city to really kind of blow it out of the water and be the next, example of how you can do this.
I love competition, and I love and mayors are very competitive because they want bragging rights, and if their competition does something, they want to get on board. It was just like Oakland was the unlikely inspiration for opening streets to people, the unlikely inspiration for transforming streets into outdoor seating for restaurants during the pandemic was Vilnius, Lithuania. And then I remember when I saw a staff report in Calgary, quote, Vilnius, Lithuania, as a model inspiration for transforming sidewalk and parking and street space to outdoor seating for restaurants so that they would survive the pandemic economically. I thought, did you ever think you were going to see Vilnius, Lithuania quoted? But it was the first city in Europe that they closed down their whole city center and created an outdoor cafe, an outdoor restaurant for the whole city center. So, and no one expected that.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't Vienna, it wasn't Paris, it wasn't Copenhagen, it was Vilnius, Lithuania. So by all means, to the cities out there, if you want to put your mark on the city building and urban transformation map, be the kind of city that is punching above its weight. One of the cities I advise in Canada is Kingston, Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
And Kingston is a medium-sized, historic, conservative city that had a lot of the same car-associated issues as most other Canadian, North American cities of its size and vintage. And over the number of years I've been advising them, they have become the new rock star innovative city in terms of progressive city building in a relatively short period of time, because they had a culture of wanting to push the envelope and try things and experiment and see what works and do it all faster, frankly, than most North American cities do. I do a lot of work in Latin American cities, and I say that North American cities could learn permanency around a good idea from Europe. We have a tendency to do things temporarily and not permanently when it's a good idea. And we can learn speed from Latin American cities where I work, because they know a good idea when they hear it, and they get it done a lot faster with a lot less excuse and a lot less money spent too. So, there are inspirations all over the world, but as I say, I like the unlikely hero who's punching above their weight.
Well, I think you have given us a lot to think about, and really an inspiration and of some energy that there is this momentum. There are lots of different sectors who we haven't had on board as collaborators and champions that we now do, and plenty of examples, whether here in North America or elsewhere, who have done it and done it well, and we can learn from them. And there really are no excuses when you talk to folks who don't think that this is possible. So
That's
thanks
right.
so much for joining me today on the podcast. I could talk to you for another half an hour. There's so much to discuss, so we'll have to invite you back.
My pleasure, anytime.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. Change for Good Roads is a podcast of Parachute, Canada's national injury prevention charity, whose mission is for Canadians to live long lives to the fullest by preventing serious and fatal injuries. We release episodes of this podcast monthly on the second Tuesday of the month. Change for Good Roads is made possible through the generous support of our road safety partner, Desjardins Insurance. On the next episode, we'll be talking about multi-modal transportation and road safety. You can find the Change for Good Roads podcast on Spotify and Apple iTunes. Make sure to use the hashtag #ChangeForGoodRoads when you share the podcast with others on social media or by sending a link out to your networks. Subscribing to the podcast and giving it a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts will also help listeners find this podcast.
This is Story Studio Network.